reality, one God, one life, one way, one reality, one God, one life, one way, one reality, one God, one life, one way, one reality. Hi everybody, I hope you're still with us. I hope you've been checking out all the other videos. This is In Search for Truth. We've been talking about the Noahide laws. Name's Hiram, and remember Jack. Today we are going to deal with the issue of external sources that deal with the Noahide laws, not necessarily from just what we know of Judaism, the teachings of Israel, but something that comes from as early as possible time. And what we're going to do is focus on the first century, the turn of the century, of the Common Era. So without further ado, I just want to ask you, Jack, what do you know of the first century of our time? What source is there that we can look at to show that this was an understood teaching, and it's not something that just came about recently? Although most recently there's a lot of people coming to the knowledge of the 7 laws.
Right. Well, actually, as you know, the 7 laws, the Sheva Mitzvot is not something new. It's actually very ancient. Mm-hmm. It's more ancient than Judaism in some way, because it goes all the way back to Adam, and eventually, of course, with Noah and all his descendants. So it's not anything that's new. Most people think it's something new, but it's actually something that's very ancient. Jeremiah, for example, he talked about returning to the ancient paths. Mm-hmm. That might be kind of consideration within the context you'd have to look at and see, but he does talk about returning to the ancient paths, the ancient ways. Most people want something new today, mm-hmm. So we see religions evolving into something spectacular. People always, it's kind of like you have this incident that occurs in the not so New Testament, and Paul is in Athenia, and the Athenians were great religious people, and they had these markers, these emblems that was made to all these different gods, and they were so religious. In fact, it says actually in the text, it actually says superstitious, but they were so religious, mm-hmm. they even had a marker that was made to the unknown God, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And according to what the text says, Paul says, this is the one I want to talk to you about, the one you don't know. Mm-hmm. So the people, in some sense, have always been religious, but they're always looking, like for the Athenians, they were always looking for something new, mm-hmm. rather than looking at what we have that exists. And that's the way religions evolve. It's always a creation of things. So Catholicism was something that came out of a Messianic movement, a first century Messianic movement. Catholicism evolves out of that. And of course in the 1500s, with the exception of little splinter groups up until the 1500s, when you have Martin Luther, mm-hmm. that actually revolts against Catholicism. He rejects basically the oral traditions of Catholicism to a limited degree or to a greater degree, and becomes the protester. And we get the word Protestant from that. And the Protestant Reformation era begins from that. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you have all these other different groups that springs up. So you not only have what they call the Lutheran Church that began with Martin Luther, then you have other groups that sprang from that. You have the Baptists, the Anti-Baptists, you have the Methodists, the Puritans, all these different groups, and they sprang out of that because there was a rejection of tradition. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they rejected the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church, and Martin Luther's whole cry that started this whole transformation period was solo scriptura. Mm-hmm. In other words, he said scriptures alone. Mm-hmm. And so people began studying the scriptures, and as they began studying the scriptures, they began to interpret it from themselves. And so some would say, okay, well, I've read this text and it says this, and this is the way we're going to create our religion from this one text. Some other people could read the same text and do just the opposite of that. Right. And so you had groups that sprung up. People generally within religious groups don't like to hear it, but like from among the Baptists, you actually have the Church of Christ actually evolves out of the Baptist organization. because there was a disagreement between one gentleman and several people. There was disagreement within the Baptist movement. The Church of Christ actually sprang out of that. Church of Christ won't recognize that, but that's really what happened. And so, this whole evolving religious thing.
So you're saying there was like a domino effect that started within the first century,
yes,
and it kept rolling through. So I think it was 1050 or so, there was a split there too,
yes,
where the Orthodox Greek split off from the Roman Church at the time.
Yes.
Which after that is when you begin to see the entitlement of Roman Catholic Church versus Orthodox Greek, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're saying a chain effect started happening.
Exactly.
After somewhere around 100 CE or something like that, from there on, where it started changing. So, but going back to that first beginning of that, what is it that they taught? How did they view things compared to what modern religion has brought us?
Well, let's go back to what actually starts this kind of domino effect, of not really religions falling, but the rise of religions and the different religions. But if we go back to the first century, and people, the one thing I remember always typical people, when I was within Christianity, as most people know, and if you don't know, I was actually a former independent Baptist minister. I graduated from Tennessee Temple University with a degree in pastoral leadership. And what began this whole gamut of what happens is in the first century, supposedly we have this guy that rises up that becomes this messianic figure, and eventually, of course, we know he dies. But the people that his followers, for some reason or other, continue with this belief that this guy is still the Messiah, even though he's dead. And to later on to prop that up, they even come up with the idea that the Messiah had to come one time and die, and the next time he had to come back again to do whatever else he needed to do. Because you have to prop that up. There's no way you can support that from
the Hebrew Scripture.
So you have to prop it up in some way to say, well, you split it up in time period. And so they would actually go to a text like in Isaiah, read a couple of verses about what the Messiah is supposed to do. Then they would stop and say, okay, fulfill that part, but he'll have to come back to fulfill the rest of it,
Gotcha.
So it's like in mid-stride, And so what we want to look at, what was going on with this first century movement that started this rise of all these religions that we see today. I mean, it starts with this little first century Jewish Messianic group. And most people don't realize this, but there were no non-Jews actually actively involved in this group until about 25 or 30 years after the fact. So we want to look at what's going on in this group. Now, there was a book years ago that I ran across when I was going through some of my studies, and it was a book that is entitled Jesus the Pharisee, and it says, a new look at the Jewishness of Jesus, and it's by an Orthodox rabbi. It's by Rabbi Harvey Falk. Now, his whole book was centered around a letter that was written by one of the sages of Israel in the 1500s. He was a great sage in Europe. His name was Rabbi Jacob Emden. And he wrote this little tract dealing with his particular view about Christianity. Now, it's not the fact that I'm going to take everything that he says, but he does I think there's actually a guy on YouTube that actually does some videos based on this letter. I saw him a couple of times. Never really got to look at them all. But Jacob Emden's whole view of what he viewed as really early Christianity, was this view of what was the non-Jews' role within this Messianic group. And the non-Jews' role was they were to be obedient to the 7 laws. And in fact, he kind of takes this worldview that was the whole intent of this Messianic movement was to teach these 7 laws to the world. Now, I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I understand where he's coming from.